If you had Trey Tucker as your wide receiver 1 for week number 3, put your hand up. Now put it back down because I know you are lying. Seriously, if you did put him in their lineup as your wide receiver 1, then go buy yourself a lottery ticket because seriously, no one had a 40-point fantasy performance coming from Trey Tucker. And now with Guy, he's averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game through 3 weeks. To try and make sense of everything wide receiver driven entering week number 4, here are your RotoBaller week 4 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. And we kick things off with Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers as they take on the New York Giants. Who says you can't come home again after spending one season in Chicago where Allen would finish second on the team in receptions with 70, targets with 121, and receiving yards with 744. The late free agent signee is back to his old tricks once again, leading the Chargers in receptions with 19, targets with 28, and is tied for the team lead with 3 touchdowns. And not to mention, he's second in receiving yards with 194. Digging a little bit deeper into the analytics, Allen has received a 25% target share, a 23.4% first read target share, and an air yard share of 25.6% through the first 3 weeks as he and Justin Herbert pick up where they left off back in 2023. When you put that all together, it is no wonder that Allen is among the best when it comes to fantasy production, averaging 18.8 fantasy points per game and is sitting inside the top 10 along with teammate Quentin Johnson. I bet you thought I was going to say Ladd McConkey. This week, Allen and the Chargers, they head to New York to face a New York Giants team. A New York Giants team that has allowed 46 receptions, 587 yards to opposing wide receivers for an average of 44.1 fantasy points per game, the second most. Another wide receiver I'm putting in my lineup this week. How about Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders as they take on the Chicago Bears? You know what? Jacoby Myers, put him in there. Put in Roman Dunze. He's a smash start this week. Las Vegas, they have allowed 551 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns this season to opposing wide receivers, further demonstrating the inability to prevent fantasy production as opposing wide receivers have been a chalk play, producing 43.03 fantasy points per game against his Raiders secondary, the third most. Odunze, he ought to be a smash start every single week moving forward, but if you needed a reminder, there it is. Now going back to Myers, as bad as the Raiders secondary has been, Chicago, they haven't been any better. In fact, Chicago has allowed the 4th most fantasy points to the receiver position this season, yielding an average of 41.3 per contest. They have also been the victims of 6 receiving touchdowns this season against the position, which ties them with the Dallas Cowboys for the most in the NFL. All Myers has done this season is what he does every season. While you won't find his name in the top 10 or 12, he will be firmly set in that wide receiver 2 territory, despite being drafted as a wide receiver 4 on your team. Currently, Myers sits as the wide receiver 22, averaging 13.3 fantasy points per game, which is more production than fantasy managers have been getting out of Justin Jefferson, Mike Evans, and DK Metcalf. And another start this week, how about Matthew Golden of the Green Bay Packers as they take on the Dallas Cowboys? In a difficult matchup last week, fantasy managers were given just a glimmer of hope regarding Matthew Golden's fantasy prospects this season. Against the Browns, Golden was second on the Packers in receptions and targets with 4. He also was second in snaps at 69% and routes at 26, leading the way with 52 receiving yards. Looking at his utilization, Golden's route rate per week is as follows. Week number 1, 57%. Week number 2, 68%. Week number 3, that jumped all the way up to 84%. Everything here suggests that Golden is becoming a more integral part of this offense, as many believe that he would be when he was selected in the first round of this past April's draft. Heading into week 4 with Golden beginning to trend upward is an excellent time for the Packers pass catcher to face the most generous defense in all of fantasy, the Dallas Cowboys. Last week, Dallas allowed Luther Burden III to drop 101 yards and a touchdown on just 3 receptions, while Rome Odunze added another 62 additional receiving yards and a touchdown on his 3 catches. On the season, Dallas not only allowed his league high in receiving yards, 661, and touchdown 6 to opposing wide receivers, but the 47.9 fantasy points they allow per game are 3.8 fantasy points per game more than the next closest team. Now, how about those sits? How about Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals against the Denver Broncos? The Minnesota Vikings, they have a good defense. Brian Flores, we know he loves to bring pressure. And Jake Browning, we know he's not afraid to throw the ball in tight spaces. Unfortunately for Chase, the Vikings kept the All-Pro to 5 receptions for 50 yards. Chase is averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game, but that number is kind of misleading considering 36.5 or 73% of that fantasy production came in week 2 alone. This week, fantasy production could once again be at a premium as one of the best receivers in the NFL faces the best shutdown corner that the game has to offer. Patrick Surtain II. His numbers aren't exactly of the lockdown nature this season, but the Broncos corner has only conceded 9 receptions on 213 snaps, with 134 of those coming in coverage, the most amongst corners. As a team, Denver is allowing 29.1 fantasy points per game this season, the 8th fewest, and has allowed 422 receiving yards to the position on 40 receptions. Once again, the difference will be pressure. While the Vikings sit 5th in sacks this season with 9, getting to Browning 3 times last week, the Broncos, they lead the NFL with 12 after finishing with 64 a season ago. Another alpha wide receiver that I'm seeing this week, DK Metcalf, as the Steelers face the aforementioned Minnesota Vikings. You can apply the same rationale to DK Metcalf this week for everything we just mentioned about Chase. The New England Patriots, they are a solid defensive unit. Harold Landry III, he's right there with Myles Garrett this season when it comes to getting after opposing quarterbacks. Against Landry and the Patriots, Rodgers, he threw for 139 yards, with Metcalf responsible for 32 of those yards on 4 targets. Metcalf has seen a 19.7% target share and a first read share of 23.8%. Really, man? Who else is there to throw with? Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, Ben Skoranek? Please! Even Marquise Hollywood Brown and Wan'Dale Robinson have first read target shares over 28%. This week is unlikely to be the week that the Steelers get their passing game going. Jonathan Greenard has accumulated 12 pressures in 3 contests, the 7th most in the league. And looking at that fantasy production which the Minnesota Vikings have allowed, no team has been stingier against opposing wideouts than the Vikings, who have allowed a league low 18.17 fantasy points per game, which is 3.3 fantasy points fewer than the next closest team. And finally, let's sit George Pickens this week as the Dallas Cowboys take on the Green Bay Packers. With CeeDee Lamb out at least the next 2 weeks and unlikely to be evaluated for the next 3 weeks, the Dallas Cowboys will turn to George Pickens as their number 1 wide receiver for the time being. Last week, even with Lamb limited, Pickens caught just 5 of 9 targets for 68 yards and wasn't even the number 1 pass catcher on his team. Sure, Pickens ended up with a touchdown, but Jake Ferguson led the team with 13 receptions, 14 targets, and 82 receiving yards. Pickens' air yards and air yard share are promising, sitting at 251 yards and 26.5% respectively. So despite being a sit this week, Pickens is one of a handful of players who realistically only need 1 reception to have themselves a 10 to 12 point fantasy week. Micah Parsons will be looking to exact some revenge on Dallas management, and what better way to do it than to make Dak Prescott as uncomfortable as possible. To move the ball against pressure, Dallas is going to have to dink and dunk, which is not really beneficial to what Pickens does best or his fantasy success. Green Bay is currently the 5th most difficult matchup for fantasy receivers, allowing 25.6 fantasy points per game and surrendering 285 receiving yards to the position on 34 receptions. Now, if you haven't already done so, hit that like and follow button and be sure to head to RotoBaller.com for all the latest fantasy news and analysis. We'll see you next time.